What did you learn from your father? Robert's response: My father was an exceptional individual. I looked up to him from a young age and felt honored to be his son. Teachers at school would often recognize my name on the class roster and ask if Ralph Kiyosaki was my dad. He was a towering figure, both physically and in the education community, as the head of education for Hawaii. With a towering height of 6'3" and a reputation as a brilliant, independent thinker, he was well known and respected in the educational circles of Hawaii. He graduated as valedictorian and was eventually honored as one of the greatest educators in the state's history. I recall the emotional moment when he showed me the newspaper article announcing the award, tears streaming down his face. He dedicated his life to education and Hawaii's children, and his legacy lives on. My father's original plan was to follow the family tradition of becoming a medical doctor. However, while still in high school on the island of Maui, he noticed a concerning trend. A large number of his classmates were suddenly disappearing from class. As student president, he investigated and approached the principal. Despite facing resistance at first, he eventually uncovered a distressing truth. The sugar plantation, where many of his classmates' parents worked, had a policy of failing 20% of the kids, regardless of their academic performance, to secure a steady supply of uneducated laborers. This realization led my father to rethink his career path and dedicate himself to fighting against such injustices. My dad discovered that individuals within the education system, including teachers and principals, were complicit in this practice. This realization motivated him to forego medical school and pursue a degree in education, with the goal of transforming the system. He dedicated himself to providing the best possible education to students whose families could not afford private schools and who were reliant on the public education system. Throughout his life, he remained committed to this cause, advocating for educational equality and fairness. However, our country's education system is just getting worse. America has one of the worst educational systems in the world, yet it spends more money on education than any other country does. As hard as my dad fought, the state of Hawaii continues to have one of the worst education systems in America. The May 2006 issue of Honolulu magazine ran a cover-page article grading public schools in Hawaii. The article stated that the National Education Association, NE, rated Hawaii as number 43 out of the 50 states, in other words, the 7th lowest in the nation. It issued a D in standards and accountability, an F for school climate, a D for improving teacher quality, and a C in adequacy of school resources. This is not caused by a lack of money. In 2001, the budget for the educational system was $1.3 billion, and in 2006 it is $2.1 billion, as the article stated. But while legislators are forking over more money today than they did 5 years ago, taxpayers aren't seeing any payoff. One thing that hasn't changed much about our government-run school system is its remarkable ability to resist change. My father decided to run for the position of Lieutenant Governor of Hawaii, recognizing that his efforts as the Superintendent of Education were limited. He ran as a Republican in a heavily pro-labor Democratic state, but his campaign was unsuccessful. This political defeat had significant personal consequences for my father. Not only was he banned from holding a government job in Hawaii again due to his challenge to the political establishment, but his friends, who he had worked with for years, turned against him out of fear of losing their own jobs. The cowardice and betrayal of his colleagues took a severe toll on my father, and he was devastated by the loss. He was around 50 years old at the time, and he never fully recovered from the emotional and professional blow. In 1974, I returned from Vietnam and found my dad sitting in his home, only in his 50s, a broken man. He had tried to make some money by purchasing a national ice cream franchise. He took an early retirement and withdrew most of his savings and lost it all on the franchise. If not for the small check he received from the state, and later from Social Security and Medicare, he would have been destitute. That moment marked a turning point for me. It was distressing to see my beloved and respected father sitting in his living room, spending his days passively watching television. Despite being highly educated, he was shattered and defeated. Over time, he grew increasingly bitter, both towards himself and towards the friends who he felt had let him down. He was sitting there watching TV when he gave me the advice I talked about earlier. Go back to school, get your master's degree, then your PhD, and get a job with the government. Poor Dad. He was sincere in his recommendation. That was what he had done. After all, he believed in education. He had dedicated his life to it. At that moment, I realized that education was missing something vital. Our traditional education did not prepare us for the real world. It prepared us to be employees. It was then that I knew I would follow in the footsteps of my rich dad and not my real dad's. I decided to follow in my rich dad's footsteps because he did not let his lack of formal education crush his entrepreneurial spirit or his desire to teach and mentor his son and me. For those of you who don't already know, he ultimately became one of the richest men in Hawaii. 1974 was a defining year for me. First, because I knew I would not follow in my father's footsteps. Years later, I realized that 1974 was also the year ERISA, which led to the 401k, was enacted. By seeing the world through my father's eyes, I knew it would be my generation, the baby boom generation, that would be facing the same plight my dad was facing. At that time, I realized the importance of a well-rounded education, including financial literacy. My generation was being taught to be highly educated and hardworking, but not equipped to handle their finances independently. In the future, there will be millions of people, like my father, facing financial insecurity despite a lifetime of hard work. Out of respect, I waited until 5 years after my father's passing to release Rich Dad Poor Dad. While some might view it as disrespectful, I believe that my father, with his strong character, would have been able to handle the truthful portrayal in the book. He was a remarkable man in every aspect. He was a big man in more ways than just height. I wrote the book to pick up the torch my father carried and continue the fight to reform and change the current educational system that is obsolete, out of touch with the world, and in my opinion, not preparing many of our youth for the world ahead, as I have been saying for years. Why doesn't our school system teach us about money? Regardless of whether we are rich or poor, smart or not smart, the one common denominator we all have is that we use money. Robert Kiyosaki. Time magazine ran a cover story with a blaring headline about the United States being a dropout nation. The magazine article uncovered the practice of underreporting dropout rates by school administrators, similar to how Enron concealed its financial losses. The situation today is even graver than before, as dropouts no longer have access to high-paying factory jobs. Instead, they are limited to low-paying positions as clerks or fast food employees, as America transforms into a consumer-based society rather than a producer-oriented one. The ramifications of this problem will be felt for years to come, due to the inflexible and outdated education system that refuses to change. That's what I inherited from my father. I continue his mission. The distinction is, I do it from the outside of the system. I don't confront the system directly. I do it as a wealthy individual, instead of as an employee who requires a stable income. As some of you are aware, the Rich Dad Company has several educational programs in place. At the college level, the Rich Dad Company has created curricula for 2 college courses, Rich Dad's Cash Flow Personal Finance course and Rich Dad's Real Estate Investing. These curricula, as well as all of the lesson plans, supplemental materials and video lessons are also free of charge and available to colleges and universities around the world. Courses are currently offered in cities across the United States. We all have defining moments. It is in these moments that we find our true characters. We become heroes or cowards, truth tellers or liars. We go forward or we go backward. Robert Kiyosaki. Donald's response. My father's influence. Today is a very beautiful day in May, and I'm in my jet on the way to Canwan Island in the Grenadines, not far from St. Bart's. I have a resort development there that includes a golf course and villas, and this is one fantastic destination point, provided you like paradise. I'm going to visit to check it out for a couple of days, and this quiet time while flying is one part of traveling that I like to take advantage of. However, Robert called me just before I left and asked me this question. Donald, what would you do if everything was taken away from you? He mentioned that Henry Ford said he'd make it all back in 5 years, and that Picasso would keep on painting, and so on. I've already been through one reversal that could have been a total wipeout and difficult to recover from. But I came back to be far more successful than I was before, so I can safely say I'd just keep at it, which is what I did. But then I got to thinking about my father, Fred Trump, who had a wipeout in his life at an early age. His father died when my father was 11 years old, which left him as the man of the house with a mother and 2 siblings to care for and watch out for. It was the defining moment in my father's life. He immediately began taking odd jobs, shining shoes, delivering for a fruit market, hauling lumber on a construction site. He graduated from high school, but couldn't even consider going to college. So he went to work as a carpenter's helper for a home builder in Queens, New York. 1 year later, he built his first home, and he called his company Elizabeth Trump and Son because he was too young to be in business for himself and had to have his mother sign all the legal documents and checks. My father became so successful that he was able to send his younger brother to college at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he earned a Doctor of Philosophy, and he was also able to marry my mother and start a family. Long story short, he was a self-made man starting at age 11, and he was a great example to learn from. He was someone who never took anything for granted and who maintained very high standards for himself in both good times and bad. My dad never found time to whine. He just put in the work, and that's a lesson in itself. Whenever I faced challenges, I thought of my father's struggles and pushed through. I can say from personal experience that persistence is key. People like Henry Ford and Picasso understood the importance of work, and it applies to any field you're in or want to pursue. Robert has two father figures, one wealthy and one impoverished. He was fortunate enough to have two role models to observe and choose from as a mentor. He found the most valuable lessons from his father, who lacked a formal education. This father taught him to think for himself, similar to Robert's own father. There's a takeaway for everyone here. While I value education highly, life experience sometimes cultivates individuals with exceptional common sense. My father was an intelligent person, and combining that with his strong work ethic made him a formidable force. Produced an effective dynamo. My dad was a fantastic source of inspiration and a great role model. He didn't have to explicitly tell us that success comes from hard work and discipline. We learned that just by observing him work tirelessly day after day. Yet, his work was never a chore. He had a real passion for his business and was truly enthusiastic about it. His influence has left a lasting impact on me, and I am thankful for it. To this day, I receive letters from people who knew my father and were touched by his generosity and work ethic. I received a letter recently from someone who remembers that my father used to go around picking up nails from the ground at construction sites. He hated waste, and to him this wasn't an annoyance, but part of being conscientious and doing a good job. My father was thorough, and he always told me, "Know everything you can about what you're doing." Fred Trump. I listened to him and took his advice. When people ask me why I think I'm successful, the first thing I think about is my upbringing and my father's influence. Yes, I went to Wharton, but before Wharton was my father. If he could achieve what he did without the benefit of family financial support and education, my expectations for myself would have to exceed those of my father, simply because I had so much more to start with than he did. We had the same standards for achievement and the same work ethic, but the conditions were different. I literally couldn't accept doing any less than I am doing now, because I wouldn't have one single excuse for doing otherwise. So if I am perceived to be a driven man, there's a very good reason behind it. Replace your excuses with reasons and everything will become clear. Again, know everything you can about what you're doing. Fred Trump. What did you learn from your father that has helped you become successful today? If your father was not a positive role model in your life, describe the influence of another man who greatly influenced your life.